All right. We welcome you to the More to the Story podcast. I believe I am live, and I'm thankful for this opportunity to reflect on what has happened this past year. A couple of tips are coming for 2025 and some reflections or reviews of events that have happened that I think are significant for my unique audience in 2024. So I'm so glad you have joined us for the More to the Story podcast. Generally, this podcast comes out every week on Thursdays, though I've had a somewhat busy last 6 months. And so it hasn't always happened on Thursdays. Nevertheless, I'm thankful for the opportunity to interact with so many of you who are a part of this audience. In general, what my podcast and the things coming from AndyMiller3rd.com are trying to do are to present information from an Orthodox Wesleyan perspective to the pan-Wesleyan world. Now, at the same time, we have many people who are not a part of any institutions in that world who find it interesting. And so it's not just limited to that, but that's the perspective I come from, the institution I serve. And a big piece for me in 2024 was that I started to serve as president of Wesley Biblical Seminary. That connects with who WBS is called to be as we serve from this evangelical Wesleyan perspective in the context of thinking of training and developing and sending forth trusted leaders for faithful churches. So you have heard me say many times that this podcast is sponsored, it's brought to you by Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we're doing just that here with more than 700 students. We had more than 700 students this past fall, and looking forward to a similar number this coming spring, and thankful for the opportunity to serve people there. Well, the mission of WBS is connected to a classic Wesleyan theology rooted in the authority of Scripture. And that's the foundation for who we are as an institution. But what we found is that there's a wider audience than just those who would identify with any denomination with the word Methodist or Wesleyan in them. So it's not just limited to that, but that's the foundation from which I have this podcast. So I'm thankful for opportunity to share with so many of you on this. So here's what I want to do on today's podcast. I want to go over a few of the kind of key stories that have happened in this world, in the Wesleyan world in 2024. I want to talk about some things that have happened on the podcast, but I also want to reflect on a few tips. I want to offer a few tips for 2025. Now, nobody came to me and said, Andy, please give me your tips. So I want to be cautious as I say this, that I'm not, I think there might be some things from my journey that might be helpful to you. I know that particularly anybody in my audience, if we were to sit down for a cup of coffee, I imagine that you would have some things that would be a benefit to me. So just take this hopefully in a humble spirit. That's the spirit from which it comes. I hope that you'll take it that way. And maybe there'll be something that you could add to this. And I think this is happening. I'm not sure. It's not quite on live on Facebook, but so I'm not on YouTube. I can interact with people more there. So I'm sorry that I'm not able to interact with some comments that come along the way. So those of you who followed me for a while know that one of the key things that I try to encourage people to do is get a consistent Bible reading plan. Consistent Bible reading plan. I don't know who said it first. I've heard Craig Groeschel say it. I've heard other kind of leadership speakers say that we overestimate what we can do in the short term, and we underestimate what we can do in the long term. And I love the opportunity for these 2 days, December 31st and January 1st. I like to think in the big kind of macro picture of the year. I like to think what's going to be happening in the coming year. I like to think of what's happened this past year. And I love long-term goals. I like to set these goals out, and I like to plan for them. And I've really adopted that idea that I can sense the tendency in myself to overestimate what I can do in the short term, but setting up consistent rhythm. So the number one rhythm that I encourage people to pursue, to make a goal around, is a consistent Bible reading plan. Because I believe this crazy thing. I believe that the creator of the universe, God, who has always existed as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, has communicated with us clearly through the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments. Divine revelation exists, and it exists primarily through scripture. So so I don't ever want to seem dogmatic with this. I have for more than 20 years I've read the Bible in a year. I've taken many different Bible reading plans. I was tempted to put some of those plans here in the show notes, but you can just go to Google and type in Bible reading plans, or if you have the Bible app, there's plenty of plans there. You can listen to the Bible. I've heard that there's I listen to the podcast most days. It comes out most weekdays, that is, The World and Everything in It. And I heard just this morning or yesterday morning, they have there's a new app or a podcast that's like the Commuter Bible, which reads the Bible every day to you. I'm guessing that's what it is. So there's all kinds of ways to do it. But I was encouraged this past year in a conversation with emeritus professor and board member of WBS, Dr. John Oswalt. Many of you will know him for in the academic world. And just pastors will probably know of his work on Isaiah, the definitive commentaries in the New International Commentary in the Old Testament that Urban's published his 2-volume work there, much less his work that most students at WBS will read, Called to be Holy. Him as a preacher in this tradition, former president of Asbury University, interim president here at WBS, interim president of Francis Asbury Society, and current professor at Asbury Seminary. So, his influence is wide and long. And so I've had the privilege, particularly in the last 6 months, to have more time with Dr. Oswalt. And one of the interesting things that he said, and I think actually this came at the WBS reunion in August, my family is sitting around the table with him and Karen, and he said that at this stage in his life, something that he's doing differently is that he is reading just 1 chapter a day. So he's not going too quickly through the Bible. And here's somebody, who's written more pages about the Bible than are in the Bible. Okay. So, I mean, this is significant. And so I thought that was interesting. So I want to keep that in mind. Like, I don't ever want this to seem like in order to be a faithful Christian, you have to read the Bible in a year. I don't believe that at all. But I do think that rhythm can be something that can be helpful to you. So just the basic math that I've presented many times on the podcast and other places is this. So there are approximately, I'm going to use a calculator here, 775,000 words in the Bible. That's like the number of words. Now, I didn't go through and count them myself, but you get the idea. Okay. So if there are 775,000 words in the Bible, and you divide that by 365, you come up with, you need to read 2,123 words a day. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Most people, an average reader reads 250 words a minute. Now, then if there's like a slow reader, let's just say like it's 200 words a minute. I probably am a slow reader. I actually haven't timed myself. That would be a good thing to do. But I haven't timed myself, but I would think I'm a slow reader. I'm certainly a fast talker, but I maybe just deliberate over words for a long time. Well, so let's just cut that in half. So between the average reader and the slow reader is 200 words. Let's say 225 words a minute. So if you take that, if you need 2,123 words a day, and you divide that by 225, you get up to 9.43683,409. So that would mean you would need to read the Bible, if you read 225 words a minute, for 9.43 minutes a day, and you would get through the Bible in a year. Now, again, this is that underestimating what we can do in the long term. So I encourage people just to think about that. On average, if you read the Bible for 10 minutes a day, you will get through the Bible in a year. I've used a Bible reading plan from the Navigators that I found really helpful. And it just has generally an Old Testament passage and a New Testament passage every day. Now, another way to think about this was something I got from Dr. Ellsworth Callis, who is my preaching professor, and he served as president of Asbury Seminary as well, a great mentor in my life. He talked about the 3+5 plan. And so he just divided it by chapters. So if you read 3 chapters a day, Monday through Saturday, and 5 on Sunday, you get through the Bible in a year. Of course, there are all kinds of other ways to do it. I do a plan that kind of jumps around a little bit. That makes it so that at key seasons, I land in certain passages. So during Advent, I'm reading the end of Isaiah, Isaiah 40 through 66. I read Revelation. I get to and then I generally have already gone through Luke or Matthew. I like to, or John, the beginning of John, and I try to get through those at that time. Just a few ideas. Of course, there is chronological plans. There's plans where you can just go from the Genesis to Revelation. I've done that. Just do it, whatever it is. And maybe you don't want to. I've heard some people say to me, well, I just feel like I'm rushing by reading that fast. Or some people say it's going too slow. Maybe you could get on a 2-year plan, a 3-year plan. Just get a plan. This is a great time to do that. The Navigator's a Bible reading plan that I have, what it does is it has 25 readings a month. That gives you kind of a grace days, so to speak, of 4 to 6 days, so that if you miss a day, you can catch up. I've always got it in, and when I've used that plan in one time I ended in November, but generally I end sometime mid-December, and I like that. And then you can do sometimes where sometimes when I'm on a plane, I'll read the historical books of the Old Testament. I'll try and knock those out, and then it gives me time to spend more time later. So anyways, just get a plan as you head into this year. Now, I want to share another thing that I've done, and I don't know where I got this advice, but I've experienced the benefits of this advice ahead of it, so that when I heard this idea, I was able to modify it for myself. I have the blessing of having 2 Bibles from my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, whose name I share, Andy Miller, Commissioner Andy Miller. So, and he, it's one of the interesting things about my life is that he was pretty engaged here at Wesley Biblical Seminary before I ever knew it existed. Well, one time, I think it was 2004, we were with him at the end of the year, and he had read this Bible, which was just a CEV, Contemporary English Version, and he underlined major portions of it and wrote notes. Oh, you can't quite see it on this passage because of the way my camera works. But, and then he gave it to me. And it was an incredible blessing. And I saw his thoughts throughout the year. I saw names written down, prayer requests, memories that he had from different times. Then after he died, my grandmother gave me another Bible of his, which was similar. But this one he went through in another year, long before. And even at the very beginning of it, some of you can see this. I had a Down syndrome aunt named Martha. And so I think he read this one in the year that she died. And so there's this service, the bulletin of that service at the front of that Bible that he taped in there. It's fascinating. So he had this Bible. This is a New King James Version. And like, there's little treasures in here for me. Like, for instance, right here is a Rotary Club of Duluth. This is where he was like attendance makeup card. But what's significant about this is it had a sermon outline on the back of it. So that was fascinating for me to be able to have. And so there's a little sermon that I have right there, much like some other things. And just when I'm preaching, after my message is complete and after I've rehearsed it and I'm ready to go, I'll go to those 2 Bibles and I'll look at what he did with that passage, the passage I was preaching on. Of course, to my preaching students, that assumes you're actually preaching from a passage of Scripture. All right. Okay. So you can't just come up with whatever you want to talk about. All right. We want to try and root things in actual study of a passage. Still, like, that's a real blessing to me to have these 2 Bibles. He wrote in all kinds of things. And then he also wrote in other books. So I have his set of his devotional commentaries by William Barclay. I wanted to say, some of you will know that the book of Jude has been important to me. I have a study that's available at andymiller3rd.com that goes through 6 sessions. It'd be a great thing for you to use for a Sunday school class in the new year. But as I was studying the book of Jude, I realized that this little book that my grandfather went through of this commentary, he was reading, let's see if I can find it here. He was reading it when I was born. So he dated things. So it says he finished this on 4/18/1980. That's telling you how old I was. I was born on 4/11/1980. A book of glory, all 3 sections with special meaning to my heart's needs. Thank you, Lord. So it's fascinating to me. So I know that he read this book a week before I was born. a week after the week I was born. So anyhow, those are little things. So here's the idea. I heard somebody else say this. I don't know if it's on a podcast. I don't know if it's in a blog. It was more than 10 years ago. And I thought this is something I could do for my children or grandchildren or somebody else in my life. So this past year, about this time last year, I bought a new Bible. And it's just a very simple, I don't know, maybe $20, $25, just a simple NIV, leather bound, no study notes or anything like that. It was, I like to have large print that gives me a little extra room to write. But so I used this specific Bible through the year, and this is what I did. I had my oldest son, Andy the fourth, in mind as I read this Bible this year. And so the plan, unless I lose it on the way home or something, is to give this to him on his 18th birthday, which is coming this year. Oh, Lord, help me. Anyhow, he won't be graduating high school this year. He started kindergarten when he was a little older because he would have been a young kindergartner. So we get him till he's 19, which is a blessing. All that to say, I plan to give this Bible to him this year. So here's what I did throughout the year. I started it and I wrote a note to him in the front saying what I was doing. I wrote this note on January 3rd, 2024. And then as I went through, I wrote prayers to him. And I show you, but I underlined the entire Bible, not the entire, like most pages have something written on them to him. So you can imagine if I'm doing 3 to 5 chapters a day, that gives me opportunity to do that, to describe that. And then, some of the things that I might even highlight are some background information that I've learned, to cross-textual things that I'd emphasize. I would say something like, this is one of my favorite passages. I would write at the top a prayer to him using one of those verses. And also just key doctrinal themes too. Now, you don't have, and that's kind of me as a preacher scholar, that I have some things I want to hand down to him for sure. But it could just be your own devotional thoughts. But anyways, I encourage you to, now maybe you don't have children, or maybe your children are out of the house. Well, think about doing it for somebody else. Maybe you could do this for grandchildren. Maybe you could do it just for somebody else in your life. Maybe it's a neighbor. Maybe it's somebody you're witnessing to. And then you kind of double up. Like, you want to access God's divine revelation in Scripture, and you do that every day of the year, or most days of the year, read the Bible in a year. But then your own observations are something you can hand down. And as I indicated, like, there's I don't know what be more valuable to me in my office than this Bible from my grandfather. I mean, I've a Joe Madden baseball, probably something from Tony Dungy. I have my medallion from WBS. I don't want to lose that. I have some beautiful pictures, but if I had to grab a couple of things, this would certainly be one of them. This Bible from my grandfather. So that's just a special thing, and I'm looking forward to doing this for all of my children. And then I don't know how fast the grandkids will come, if I'll be able to get them all in when they turn 18, but I want to work for that. If the Lord chooses to allow us to have grandchildren, we'll see what happens. But anyways, just encourage you, as you're at the start of this year, that might be something that you can do. Another thing that I've done for a while, and I got this advice from Abby, and I have appreciated the ministry of John and Stacy Eldridge through the years. And we will often I'll choose a word of the year. This might seem silly, but here's how I do it. Like, I think about, sometimes the word has, I've just asked God to reveal a word for me, and it's come through Scripture or other observations, something that's become prominent. So I'm going to share with you maybe I don't have them all here. Oh, I didn't bring the right journal. But I've had words like forge. Okay, for the word for 2023 was tackle. And this is what I thought. Like, I've had fortify. Oh man, I'm gonna not. I have them listed, and I kind of reflect on that every so often. But I use the word in a very particular way that I want to share with you in just a second. But in 2023, I had the word tackle, and what I had in mind there was tackling some big projects, tackling a good portion of my dissertation, tackling some tasks at WBS, tackling the needs of my family. But what I often find I often find this to be true, is that when I choose this word, by the end of the year, it ends up meaning something else than what I thought it was going to mean. So tackle ended up being I got tackled in 2023. I was like, I thought and I began to understand it through the emphasis of the need to die to self. And I began to think of that song that actually Stan Key and Dennis Kinlaw helped me think of this song, Make Me a Captive, Lord, Then at Last I Shall Be Free. This hymn about dying to self, tackle me, Lord. So I thought it was my aggressive, progressive attitude for 2023, but really it was I needed to be tackled and I needed to let God tackle me. So with that in mind, as I moved toward 2024, I haven't shared this with very many people. It's kind of a private thing in some ways. I had another word in mind. Now you're going to catch on the fact that I love sports. So that's just kind of how this came out. My word for 2024 was catch. And so I wanted to catch and grab a hold of all that God had for me in 2024. But as usual, not too long into 2024, I realized that the theme was I needed to be caught. And so I thought I was going to catch something. Again, I probably should learn this lesson when I choose this word. Okay, but here's how I use it. Here's how I use that word. I will then just like reflect on that word through the year. I'll write it in various places. I keep a journal kind of, and I don't do it every day, but I probably write in my journal 100 days a year. But here's what I do. I center my prayer time on that word. So I will write that word in. And I've had a very similar prayer that I try to say every day. Now, I also use the Wesley Covenant prayer. And so I'm just going to show you the inside of my journal. How about that? Well, I have messy handwriting, but I'll have the Wesley Covenant prayer, but then I'll have this other prayer that I write for each year. And I try to recite that prayer, say that prayer most days. And then I center it around my word of the year. So catch. I won't read the whole thing. But I'll say it's time. It's time today, Lord. Time, Jesus, for me to be caught by you. And then some of you will recognize I'm quoting something here. I'm no longer my own. I'm yours. I am thine, O Lord. I submit to your will and your way. And then this is something I've used. I've inserted the new word for the year each year. Catch me with your beauty. Let that beauty be infused. And if you allow, be seen in me. And there's another quote some of you will pick up on. All of your wonderful passion and purity catching me. Today, with your help and by your spirit, I want to rise and catch what you have for me. Help me to steward and catch your vision for the areas I steward for your glory, my marriage, my family, my gifts, WBS, and the other institutions you have called me to serve. Catch me, Jesus. Catch me, Spirit. Catch me, Father. I move forward today, conquered, dead, and with you living through me and for thy glory. So I use that word, and then every now and then I think about it, and I just put as I pray each day, I think about, I have like an image of what it's like for me to be caught by God. Now, I don't know if I've said that to very many people, but it's just something, a practice, a habit, a tip for the new year. So I've put those things in place with my own journaling and the way I think about things. And then I didn't find much in scripture, but sometimes my words for the year will be something I find in scripture. And that's always a special thing too. So those are a couple of points of tips for the new year. I've never done this before, but I realized in about February, there was one song, one hymn that was dominating my own devotional time. And so I found this song and it kind of fits in. I actually quoted it there. And it's the hymn, I Am Thine, O Lord. So it's the hymn of 2024. Not very exciting. My kids have introduced me some fun praise songs that I've enjoyed. I am thine, O Lord. And what I realized as I learned that song as I relearned that song in some ways, as I kind of brought it into my own experience, was that I had a hard time getting beyond those first three words. I am thine. I am thine, O Lord. And then, so I would try, I wouldn't always sing it, but this was something that just refocused a lot of my day. And then the chorus is, draw me nearer, 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 blessed Lord, to the cross where thou hast died. Draw me nearer, 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 blessed Lord, to thy precious bleeding side. There are depths of love that I cannot know. Till I cross that narrow sea, there are heights of joy that I may not reach, till I rest in peace with thee. So those are some things that I did for 2024. And I'd love to hear some of the things that you all do. If you want to even comment on that, on this podcast, maybe in the YouTube chat or on Facebook. I think this is live on Facebook right now. All right. So here's a couple of reflections on 2024 after those tips for 2025. So those of you who listen to my podcast on a regular basis, it's been an interesting year for the podcast. A lot has changed in my life, which has changed the way that I've gone about the podcast. But I wanted to share the top podcast. Now, there's a different way of looking at this, because there's the top podcast on YouTube. Then there's the top podcast that comes on audio downloads. And it's interesting how they're similar and different. But for this past year, the last 365 days, the number 10 podcast was actually one that was recorded in December 2023. And that was my interview with Ben Witherington on Sola Scriptura. And I actually just heard him on a panel discussion at the Evangelical Theological Society discussing this. Then number 9 was my response to Albert Mohler, United Methodism, Albert Mohler, and Slippery Slopes. This came out on May 13th. And I was thankful that Albert Mohler engaged me in that time. And then I actually had a conversation with him at ETS this past November. And he said he wanted to talk to me about it more. So that was good. But he's somebody who's certainly from a different theological tradition than me, but somebody I admire as a seminary leader who helped to bring Southern Seminary back to its founding convictions theologically. Though some of those convictions would be different from my own, but as a leader and somebody who speaks into society, there are times I disagree with him, but I enjoy I listen often to the briefing, and I really love his podcast, Thinking in Public. We both are both academic studies, historical theology. And so I find a lot of his guests to be really interesting. Nevertheless, I was ready and willing to disagree with him publicly on the way he characterized some Wesleyan denominations and their use of women in ministry and the way they interpret scripture. So I thought that was good. And I was glad for him to interact with me there. Then I also had another live podcast on May 31st, which is number 8, United Methodism, the Ivory Coast, and announcements. Then a nice surprise has been that an old podcast picked up some steam coming from summer of 2023. And it didn't have a big response then. So I don't know what happened in the analytics or the algorithms to make it go further. But number 7 is my interview with Jack Deere, Why I Am Still Surprised by the Power of the Spirit. Another one that picked up steam again. I don't even try to understand these type of things, why they get going. But my interview with Dr. David E. Clark on narcissism, that was really helpful, and enablers. Then I had my interview with N.T. Wright about Into the Heart of Romans, which is number 5. And then the oldest podcast that just never seems to die. As far as like its impact, it was even number 4 this past year, was from 2022. So the 4th podcast, the most on YouTube at least, was my podcast with David E. Clark, Enough is Enough. And every year, I mean, this is one of so since, I guess it's not that many years, but this is the third year, I've had at least 4 people reach out to me who have got out of abusive situations because of that podcast. And then many people, there's often comments, I can't keep up with them on YouTube, people responding to that. So if you haven't seen that, if you know somebody who is in an abusive situation, and Dr. Clark really works through what that means, I would encourage you to share that podcast. Then I have a short clip, just a very short piece that has caught attention, a little sliver of an interview with N.T. Wright. That's number 3. Number 2 was my conversation after the United Methodist General Conference with Rob Renfro and Tom Lambrick, United Methodist General Conference Reflections. And then number 1 was a podcast that really took off. It was like a last second sort of thing. I wanted to connect with somebody who was at the United Methodist General Conference. Was my interview with Tom Lambrick. Disaffiliation isn't over. The UMC General Conference. And Tom did a great job explaining what was happening there. That one has 21,000 views. And so that just came out. That came out in April. So there's the top 10 podcasts on YouTube. But interestingly enough, it's a little bit different when it comes to the audio podcast. So let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So number 10 was my comments about the Southern Baptist Convention and the United Methodism and the Salvation Army and kind of the connections that are between that. That was also a part of that response to Albert Mohler. Then another one that has just gotten a lot of, I'm surprised it wasn't in the top 10 for 2024 on YouTube, but my interview with Chris Bounds, Dr. Chris Bounds, on whether the United Methodist Church and the split with the emergence of the Global Methodist Church, whether that represents schism or death. And that's a provocative presentation from Chris Bounds that I agree with. Then I also had my interview with Steve Blakemore and Robert Gagnon on the He Gets Us. So that didn't do as much on YouTube, but that was number 7 on audio. Then my interview with Kevin Watson, that didn't make the YouTube cut either. Number 6 on his book, Doctrine, Spirit, and Discipline. Then my interview with Mark Olson was on John Wesley and Aldersgate. Then Tom Rayner, who is really interesting. Some of you will know him from churchanswers.com. He had some thoughts. He had an article that came out about the Global Methodist Church and trying to leverage that moment for the churches to be healthier. Then number 4, I think I messed up the numbers in there somewhere, but was my interview with Billy Coppage, good friend, who talked about orality and missions. Then again, we get into the 2 podcasts about with Tom Lambrick and Rob Renfro were number 3 and 2. And then number 1 on the audio podcast was entitled United Methodism, Albert Mohler, and Slippery Slopes. So that was the number 1 there. Oh, so I thought that was just a helpful thing for those of you who are interested in the podcast and maybe even some of the decisions that I make about it. I have some exciting podcasts coming up in this coming year. And it took me a little while to get my feet set with it in light of some of you'll know that we're still hiring a cabinet at Wesley. I'm still hiring a cabinet at Wesley Biblical Seminary. I haven't had an administrative assistant. So it was a little hard to keep things going, but I feel like I've kind of got my bearings once we got through the fall semester. Once finals were over, I was able to get some things set up. So I am in conversation with Tom Wright again to have him come on to talk about his book on Acts. I think that it's going to happen in March. So I was excited about that. He was such a kind person, the way he responds to me. I think a major book has just been released, Mere Christian Hermeneutics by Kevin Van Hooser. Some of you will see some of the things I've written in the past, know that he's been an influence on me. I was, some people get nervous when they talk to various people, but I was a little nervous even emailing him. But I'm going to be interviewing him. Also, some will know the name Philip Jenkins, who's a historian. His famous book came out more than 20 years ago, The Next Christendom. He has another book that's come out about religion and history that I'm looking forward to talking to him about. Let's see. Then I'm really excited to talk to Daniel Silman. He is, I think I'm saying his name right, but he's been the person, I don't know if he's the editor at Christianity Today, but he's been somebody who's been covering what's been happening in Methodism, but he's also a scholar, and he's written a book on Richard Nixon and Richard Nixon's faith. So I wanted to see what, just get his perspective from that seat as a journalist who's covering a lot of things happening in Wesleyanism. So that's going to happen. I'm going to have that. And I also have Mark Olson coming back. He has a book on justification. Then let's see. I have, Sam and Tom Raymer coming back, J. Warner Wallace, Clay Seidenbecker, who's the guy who wrote the article, Wesley is Fire, that was in Christianity Today that quoted me, Chris Lorstofer, various people kind of who are connected to our podcast. Clay Sidebender. Then I have, let's see, on the, these are all the interviews I have. Daniel Hummel, who has written a very interesting book. Now, this might be a kind of a geek out moment for people who are interested in evangelical history for me, but a great book called The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism. And that intersects a lot with some Wesleyan ideas. Then there's a woman who's written a book on the history of Christian contemporary music called Leah Payne. I have several other people I'm interacting with. So those will all come out in the next few months or so. I think next week I have a podcast coming out with Tim Wildman and MD Perkins. They have a new documentary that's just come out with American Family Association on the founder, Don Wildman, called Cultural Warrior, which I know sounds like something you shouldn't pursue, but anyways, that's something that they've done. And it was a really interesting interview just to think about what's happened in the last 50 years. And a lot of that happened before I was born. And then some of it were things that were impacting me. So there was some history behind that that I haven't studied or don't know about. So I think that might be something interesting to you all as well. I do hope to have in this coming year, I have the 2 courses, the one on heaven and the one on Jude, but I have 2 other courses that I'm trying to get out there. They're already done, but I'm just having a hard time getting them uploaded. So that would be something you all can find there. Now, I wanted to highlight just a couple of stories from this year that have happened in the Wesleyan world. Sadly, maybe just because of my busy schedule this year, I've struggled to was able to do the thing I had done in the last couple of years, and that was I had Ryan Danker and Jonathan Powers on to talk through those like kind of top 10 stories. So I just wasn't able to make that happen, but I thought I would share some of those with you here. So I think there was a couple of things, and I'll try and go as best I can in reverse order. I'll hit these stories. So in January, I think there's a great, speaking of Ryan Danker, he organized an event with the Institute on Religion and Democracy and their new program that's called the John Wesley Institute. WBS was a part of the initial conversations to make that happen. I guess now 3 or 4 years ago, really delighted about what's happened with that group. And 2 things that happened with that group that I think we should recognize this year. One, it hosted the second event, which was a group of scholars. I think about 60 scholars came together in Washington, D.C. to formulate a document, a consensual document for the Wesleyan tradition about the doctrine of holiness. 3 years ago now, we came together and did something similar just on basic theology, like a theological approach, and it was called The Faith Once for All Delivered. Then Seedbed published that. And so we all came together. We all, everybody had writing assignments, and this is the same thing with the holiness document. And then that came together, and we all then put our names to it about that document. In the Faith Once for All Delivered, the section I was responsible for in my subgroup, which was led by Ken Collins, I had just something that ended up being just a paragraph. It was a couple of pages, but it got reduced. So it was on eschatology, in the Order Salutis. Then this past year, I was a part of the group that talked about social implications of holiness. So that was a fun thing to do. But I think that will be a significant document, kind of marking where the Pan-Wesleyan movement is at this stage. And there's a lot of, not just fun for me, but I think there's a lot of synergy that comes from those events. Another thing that happened with the John Wesley Institute is significant with another institution that in the Wesleyan tradition is Good News for United Methodists. Charles Kaiser had established this group after he wrote an article more than 50 years ago, kind of describing the opinions of a silent minority, maybe call it silent majority. But anyways, he had an article that was published expressing Orthodox views and how he felt somewhat marginalized. And that then led to all kinds of support in the, I believe, in the late 60s or early 70s. And that then became the Good News organization. He established a magazine, Good News for United Methodists. I think he then interacted with Dr. Dennis Kinlaw, who was the president of Asbury University, Asbury College at the time. And then they came together and moved Good News to Wilmore. I think Kaiser ended up teaching at Asbury University journalism for a time. That might be a wrong fact, but I'm pretty sure that's true. Then it went down, and like other presidents became Jim Heidegger, then Rob Renfro, and it was a group, activist group, so to speak, an organizing group to help think about renewal in United Methodism. And what they did this year was after, and I think I highlighted that in my podcast, after General Conference and with the founding of the Global Methodist Church, said mission accomplished. Isn't that a beautiful thing? So they realized that the renewal of the United Methodist Church was expressing itself with the existence of the Global Methodist Church. And so Good News officially closed this year. Now, there's a couple caveats to that. One thing that I think will be announced that they did when Good News closed, and I think we'll be announcing this here soon, they gave a significant gift to 3 seminaries, and we were one of those. Wesley Biblical was one. And we received a gift to have a Charles Kaiser, somebody will correct me, scholarship. And then they're inviting some of their donors to give to that scholarship. So we've an endowed scholarship so that there will always be kind of this Good News scholarship for a Global Methodist Church pastor at WBS. That's all being established. We've signed the letter of agreement. But what a beautiful way for them to finish, for them to conclude. And then on top of that, like as they were working through that period, they also then took the Good News magazine, and I don't know if the word gift it was correct, but they gave it to the John Wesley Institute, and which is a part of the Institute for Religion and Democracy. And then Steve Beard, somebody I've just interacted with here and there a little bit. I appreciate what he's done, and he's written on the Salvation Army some, which has been interesting. They are carrying on the Good News magazine and with a pan-Wesleyan perspective. And so the board members from Good News, like people like Chris Bounds, Ryan Barnett, Helen Ray Stumbo, I'm going to start leaving people out. I interacted with them this past year as they were kind of officially saying, job well done. They concluded their mission. What a great thing, I mean, for them to do. So I think that's a significant story in this year, was what happened with Good News and that move to John Wesley Institute. Also, in this year, this may seem a little self-focused, but 2 seminaries are in the transition process. And so this is a big piece for me. Even my own year personally was working through whether or not I should apply to serve as WBS's president. And then also Dr. Tim Tennant finished his time as president of Asbury Seminary. So they're still in transition process. David Garrettson is serving as the interim leader there. We had an interim president here for 6 months with Matt Friedemann, and then I took over on July 1st. I think those are significant stories. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens this next year as well with Asbury Seminary as they appoint their new president. Dr. Garrettson's been a great help to me, and Tim Tennant for that matter. Some of you will know. So, excited to see what will happen for them in the new year as well. I think another story that's important, many of us have been looking for this type of thing, and Clay Sidebender and Daniel Silman with Christianity Today published an article that many people are taking note of, and I mentioned it earlier, called "Wesley is Fire." And and I'm going to have Clay on to talk about this article in general and how he went about it. And he started it 3 years ago, but realized that maybe he wanted to highlight a renewal within Methodism, but I don't think within the broad Methodist family. But I think he got to a place where he realized that maybe it wasn't what he thought. But then in the meantime, there was the revival, the outpouring at Asbury University, several other moves, the growth here at WBS, the emergence of the GMC, all these things started to come. And then he put that together and kind of said, well, now he sees some of that coming together in the new year. And so this was a good long article. I don't know how many words it was, probably 5,000 words. And it had key voices highlighting this moment. And this is what was exciting, is that more than 20 years ago, there was a famous article in Christianity Today called Young, Restless, and Reformed. And there was this sense that that was a movement within society of a kind of a renewal of Reformed theology. And I think there was a sense that many people in the Wesleyan tradition were saying, I think these are the type of things that were expressed by J.D. Walt 15, 20 years ago at the start of Seedbed, was that we long to see something similar, not just documented, but we just don't want the stories to be told in the coming year. Like, oh, we want our own press, but we long for there to be a renewal in the practical lives of churches and seminaries and colleges and on campuses of this tradition, with a sense that people are longing for what Wesleyan theology has to offer. That's my contention. And that's part of why I'm here at Wesley Biblical Seminary. So you can basically every podcast kind of moves in some way or another in that direction. So seeing this article that came out in September highlighting these moves, and it mentioned this podcast. I need to kind of add things up to see where they are across channels, but we are at more than 750 views and downloads. But I need to make sure I'm up on it so that when we get to 1 million, we celebrate with something. I know there are podcasts that get 1 million views in an hour. So I kind of recognize our place, but I'm thankful. I mean, he highlighted that. Also, he highlighted things happening at Asbury University, us at WBS, another podcast, another group called Holy Joys. So I thought that was a good art, and I thought that's a moment that might be looked back at historically, kind of documenting what had happened. So my appreciation to Clay, Daniel, and CT for making that happen. But of course, I think probably the number one story in the Wesleyan world for 2024 was the General Conference for the Global Methodist Church. And that general convening conference, that's the word I was looking for, convening conference. And some of you know, I've talked about already, was privileged to be a part of that body, and then on a committee that was thinking of clergy and educational requirements and that kind of thing, to be in the room when the Constitution was affirmed and voted on. Ryan Barnett, my friend, led us in that process and talked about the work of that committee. Like, they even took the computer where the document had been worked back and forth from that committee, and they prayed over that computer as they got ready to send it in to vote on that Constitution, to vote on the mission statement, which I've talked a lot about, to spread scriptural holiness across, to make disciples of Jesus Christ. Oh my goodness, I can hardly, but to make disciples of Jesus Christ and spread scriptural holiness across the globe. That being one of the last actions there was fascinating. And for me, like, I'm not trying to say I'm special, but there's a way that I'm a little bit behind the ball. Like, I'm unique in that group, in that I didn't come from the United Methodist world. And so for me, socially, there was I had to learn that world, but it was a delight to interact with so many people who listened to the podcast. Of course, now they didn't make the top 10, maybe because they were so similar, and my audience isn't just GMC, but I love the opportunity to interview the Episcopal candidates for the Global Methodist Church this year. And that was another part of this year for me that was important. And I think just to highlight like that as something that if it had been the first year, the convening General Conference of the Nazarene Church, or the convening conference of the Salvation Army, or any of those type of groups, I think that is something that should be number one. And it just happens to be in 2024, the denomination I'm a part of, and a denomination I have the privilege to serve through Wesley Biblical Seminary. That's a part of what's happening. Now, I have a friend, David Donnan, who is the leader. I think he's a communications director for the South Georgia Conference. He had his top 2024 moments in the Global Methodist Church. And I'm just a reporter here, but I'm a little embarrassed to bring this up, but he said the number one, I don't know if it's number one, but the first one he lists is the emergence of global Methodist influencers. And he brought my friend, Jeff Rickman, and me on this podcast. I'm not going to read it because that would be a little too much, but I appreciated him highlighting this podcast and its role. But then number two thing he listed was the rise of Wesley Biblical Seminary. Now, I happened to be driving back from my parents' to when this came out, so I wasn't able to read it. Or maybe we were at a rest area and I saw it and I needed to get back in the car, so I gave it to my wife and asked her to read out loud. And I don't know who said it. I think she did, but it said when she read The Rise of Wesley Biblical Seminary, she's like, well, hopefully it won't be the podcast, The Rise and Fall of Wesley Biblical Seminary. So, but I'll just read this first little bit. I won't read the bit where he talks about me, but just a few years ago, I couldn't have told you much about Wesley Biblical Seminary or even where it was located. In my conference, the Asbury Seminary to the Pulpit pipeline had long been the gold standard for producing our most effective pastors. Now, however, we're witnessing a remarkable shift as more pastors and ministry candidates gravitate toward Wesley Biblical Seminary. This growth can be attributed to several factors, chief among them being the seminary's early intentional focus on serving the Global Methodist Church, coupled with their exceptional course of study. Adding to their momentum is the leadership of Andy Miller III. He's already then describes me here. So, but then they also talk about the First General Conference, new and decentralization of leadership. That's key. Oh, man. And some of you will know I had a podcast and an article that came about that. And I was delighted to see the movement toward bishops that were not based in a given area. So I love that. I love that direction. Global Methodist. This was another one that he had. I didn't know this, so I saw it in his blog. Global Methodist member killed in Donald Trump assassination attempt. So that the person who died there, Corey Compatore, was a member of a Global Methodist church. And so Bishop Mark Webb and his pastor made a comment there. He also highlighted that Keith Boyette retired. So, and then he said, what did I miss? So anyways, I highlight that article. Thankful for David and the work he's doing there. And I had a chance to be with him and other people of the South Georgia Conference earlier this year. So those are a couple updates, reflections on 2024, and then some of my tips for 2025. As we are also moving in that direction, there's still time if you're interested in auditing classes or taking classes at WBS. We'd love to have you get in. We're emphasizing a few different classes for you: discipleship in the home. Robert Gagnon is teaching a class on 1 Corinthians, which is a key text for kind of like thinking about human sexuality in our time. It's one of a key part of his argument is related to the analogical reasoning from the case of the incestuous man committing incest in 1 Corinthians 5. But on top of that, several other points. So that should prove to be a great class if you're interested in that. We also are emphasizing the history of Christian thought, which is going to be taught by Kenny Johnston. That's a helpful class. That is a key way that we approach church history, is looking at the history of ideas and not just kind of like moving through dates and the like. So there's several classes you could audit, but also we'd love for people to consider us as a place for you to do your bachelor's, master's, or doctoral degrees. Next, I forgot to mention this. I'm also looking forward to having on a couple of Uris, URYSS, if that's how the plural is. Anyhow, we have Thane and Bill Uri, who are coming to campus next week to work with our D-Min cohort. They have week intensives in January, in June. So if you're interested in D-Min, if you're in the continental USA, you just come in for those 2-week sessions. If you're outside the USA, you can Zoom in for those classes. But those two guys will be here, and I'm going to be interviewing them, hopefully, for my podcast. I've been chasing Bill Uri for a podcast, I don't know, back in the Captain's Corner days. I'm sure I've been going after it for a long time. So I'm looking forward to having him here. But it's too late for you to get in for the D-Min for this semester, but you could get a D-Min, which starts April 1st. And I will be teaching in the D-Min course this coming April through September, a class on preaching. And the other class, that session, will be taught by Rick Boyd, Biblical Exegesis for Ministry. So those two classes will be happening, but you could still register for classes which start 2 weeks from yesterday for this coming semester. We'd love for you to check this out. Check us out at WBS. And looking forward to this year. Thanks to everybody who follows the podcast, shares links. Means a lot to me. For many of you who write me notes and comments, some of you have supported More of the Story Ministries. financially. That helps me pay for things like the podcast service and those type of things. It means a lot to me. Also, can't help it. I got to step back into my role as president here. End of the year giving, right? Don't miss your chance for tax deduction, right? To give at the end of the year to support theological education, because as goes the seminaries, goes the pastors, as goes the pastors, goes the church, and as goes the church, goes the world. If you want to make an impact in the world, what better place than do it by investing in the education and formation of pastors as we are sending out faithful pastors who are ready to serve. Trusted pastors ready to serve faithful churches. I see something else in my background. You can see right back here. I just want to highlight with my thanks to Dr. John Nyhoff, who has been promoted to glory. There is his staff right there. If I can highlight that. One of the staffs that he made that I carry and be a part of this office. And then right back here, the Bible that comes from Ivan Howard. Another case for writing in a Bible and kind of claiming it and passing it down. Like I have the great benefit of having that Bible going forward. You could, there's a new issue of the Compass, our regular magazine, that came out just yesterday. And so you can see that described there. All right. Well, for those of you who've hung in here with me for this live podcast, thank you for checking this out. Thank you for your support of More to Story Ministries. And I pray that you will have a blessed 2025. God bless you all.